Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic. This is a big week for us. We're going to pass a major milestone in listenership this week, and we'll post some stuff on social media. We've got some great shows lined up coming up in the future as well. We're going to have an astronaut and also a pilot join us for the show. He's spent, I believe, over 100 days in space. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. Mike Bush is committed to make a return to the show, and we're going to talk in depth about some things that all of us can learn from. Mike's an amazing mechanic and owns Savvy Aviation. So if you want to make sure you subscribe so we can make sure that hits your inbox when it's available. We talked to John and Martha King. They have agreed to be on the show. They took a hiatus, and they have agreed to come back and join us on the show. And if you think we're doing a good job, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. We would appreciate it. Today, Wally, you've been in training to fly a bigger jet for your company, and we decided we would talk about the evolution of flight training. Things that you're experiencing right now are very interesting compared to the way maybe training happened 40 years ago when you were in a smaller, low-wing aircraft learning how to do stalls and falls. So we're going to jump right in today. Tell us a little bit about kind of your early experiences in this training session, and then we'll kind of revert back to what it was like 40 years ago.
Well, what I wanted to talk about is how the airlines train pilots, and albeit learning to fly a 172 is different from learning to fly a big transport category jet, but at the end of the day, the objectives are the same. The objectives are to produce safe pilots. And when you go and you look at the statistics, the airlines have actually done a really good job. If you just go and look at the accidents that have happened over the last several years, you don't see too many airlines having accidents. So that says that the equipment is good and the pilots are good. The training is good. I look at how I was trained when I first started at my airline many years ago. Basically, the way it worked is you would walk in, and I'm going to use very general terms. These numbers may not be exactly accurate, but they're going to be close enough for our discussion. Basically, you'd come in and you'd probably have a week of indoctrination. We call it basic indoctrination, basic indoc. And for that first week, you'd learn about the airline policies and generic things. After that, once you got assigned to an airplane, you would actually go to a class on the airplane. And usually what would happen is you would have about a 2-week systems ground school. And it was just like a high school or a college class. You would sit in a classroom 8 hours a day, and you would be subject to a lecture. You might spend one day on the engines, one day on the hydraulic systems, one day on the pneumatic system, a day on performance, and so forth. And it was usually 2 weeks of that. Today, it has evolved to where the first day that you walk in to the airplane portion of the training, you are sitting in some sort of a training device where you are sitting in the seat and flipping switches. I'm 2.5, 3 weeks into training on a new airplane, and 3 hours after I walked into the building, our training center, 3 hours after that, I was sitting in the left seat of a 777 and going through the cockpit setup procedures, going through the start procedures. So how
Wait
has
a
it
second.
evolved?
You didn't take your written exam before you went to training?
No, no written exam before. So, how does this relate to general aviation flying? Well, so many times we hear people say they'll come into a flight school and they'll say, "Well, I talked to my next door neighbor who's a pilot, and he says I've got to get the written out of the way before I hop in an airplane." And me personally, I just cannot disagree with that more. And I know you have the same philosophy, Bobby.
Yep.
I mean, if you're going to teach someone how to play golf, you wouldn't sit them in a classroom for 4 hours and talk about how to grip the club. Probably one of the first things you would do is hand them a golf club and say, "This is how you grip the golf club." You would show them. You wouldn't tell them. You would show them. You would let them touch it, and you would let them experience that. So to sit in and read a book on how to do a stall, I think with most of us that would put us to sleep. I think most of us, when we think of a medical journal, we might think of the New England Journal of Medicine. We've all heard of that. I personally have never read the New England Journal of Medicine, and I probably never will. Now, having said that, if I had some sort of an ailment, let's just say I was, I don't know, I'm just making up a scenario here. Let's say I went out to the airport and I couldn't get my 172 started, so I tried to hand prop it, and while trying to hand prop it, I tore my rotator cuff. So let's say I was dealing with a torn rotator cuff. And all of a sudden there was an article about new treatments about torn rotator cuffs in the New England Journal of Medicine. I might read that because I might be able to relate to it. But reading stuff that you have never experienced, I don't have the capacity to comprehend. And I think most of us are probably that way. There are some people who are just very good at that and maybe could learn the information or at least retain enough to pass the knowledge test. And that's not really what we're trying to do, is just pass a knowledge test. We want to impart knowledge. Again, the bottom line is to make safe pilots, to have an accident-free aviation, general aviation. We'd like to make it accident-free. I mean, that's probably unachievable, but it's something that we want to shoot for. So, the training today, the way the airlines have incorporated things, it's a little bit of ground school and jumping in and actually doing it right now. We may read about start abnormals, and then we're going to go into a training device, and we're going to see those start abnormals. We're going to see what it looks like to have no ignition or to have too much fuel flow or whatever the abnormal may be. And I think we can incorporate that in our general aviation flying and flight training. And again, scenario-based flight training. We talk about it. I think people talk about scenario-based flight training, but how many people actually get out there and put their students in scenarios? In other words, how many times, I'd venture to say that for private pilot candidates, I'll bet most of the time that they have actually really diverted might be on a check ride with me.
Yeah, and they probably didn't do it in any other mechanism than preparing for the check ride if they did it, right? And in the real world of flying, we've been diverted, given different headings, moved around weather and a lot of different things. It's not just been A to B and maneuver after maneuver after maneuver. So, if you're sitting in the cockpit in the first 3 hours, obviously they've tested and revalidated that that's probably the best way to get someone up to speed on that new aircraft. And I think too often we don't spend a lot of time doing that in general aviation. Specifically back when I was training, we did a lot of, okay, here's the aircraft, here's how you pre-flight it. We kind of look at the POH. We kind of talk about the systems at a high level, and maybe private, you don't need to be a rock star at everything that's going on. We joke maybe you don't need to know all the numbers for or EGT and CHT when you're learning how to land, but there's a piece of that training that, if not syllabus based, it could be really just hodgepodge together, and you might not have the best experience in the world. So I'm assuming 40 years ago, when you were flying some of the same airplanes maybe that are in flight schools today, what was the approach? What did your instructor tell you to do? Did you follow a syllabus? Was there, I know it was a PTS when I was training. Was there a PTS when you were training, Wally?
Yeah, there was. But again, I've slept a whole lot between now and when I was learning to be a private pilot. I certainly don't remember a syllabus, and there certainly was not any scenario-based training whatsoever. It was just, all right, let's go out to the practice area. And quite frankly, with my instructor, there wasn't really much of a briefing. I mean, I would get there 15 minutes before he would. I would go out and pre-flight the airplane, and he would hop in, and we'd head out to the practice area. And we'd be flying out there, and I really had no idea what we were going to do when we got out there. So it has come a long way, flight training, at least. The flight training, the more formalized flight training that I have the opportunity to see at the organized flight schools.
Yeah, so back in those days, you still had to do these check rides and make these maneuvers a reality for someone that was going to, test you on those maneuvers. And I remember the PTS had a section in the front that was a special emphasis areas, and it was all about CFIT and collision avoidance and all the things that were causing accidents in the predecessing 10, 15 years. Those were areas where they wanted flight instructors to spend a lot of time and trying to train those things out. With the ACS, those special emphasis areas have been applied to all the sections, kind of an overlay to all of the applicable areas that you're going to be held to certain standards. And you, as an examiner, are watching all of those areas, but it was an intent, I think, by the FAA and others to apply scenarios or scenario-based training and incorporating all of those things, collision avoidance and whatnot, to both maneuvers and actual flying, cross countries, night flying, etc. But there's still a bunch of check boxes that we have to teach to, and I am concerned still at the school that we at times find ourselves teaching to those check boxes, teaching to what Wally's going to want to examine us on, instead of those scenario-based trainings that really do provide the best training. So in our syllabus, we do take a lot of time and effort into making sure that the student has a plan for each day, and that we're not making that plan on the way to the practice area, because that's the most expensive classroom in the world. Having a Hobbs meter running in a plane with an instructor, you definitely don't want to do that. So today's world, scenario-based training, we take on a lot of real-world activities on aviation, going from point A to point B and trying to incorporate all those things that might occur in the real world, like a diversion, like a power on stall on takeoff, or a power off stall as you're coming in to land. All those things are real, and we try not to just talk about them as the maneuver or the checkbox, but the scenario by which they're going to happen in, for sure. When you do unusual attitudes on a check ride, Wally, one of the maneuvers that I hated as a private student, what are you hoping that a student demonstrates in that? There's a scenario that's really all about, and that's that student getting disoriented, obviously, in the clouds, right? So you're hoping that student reacts in a certain way, whether they're nose high or nose low, right?
Yeah, and as I tell student pilots, if they're in the clouds, it's an emergency. Okay, it is an emergency. So, unlike an instrument applicant, instrument students are maybe going in the clouds on purpose because, that's what we're training for. But as a student pilot working on their private, if they are in the clouds, it is an absolute emergency. And, you just have to be slow, methodical, and gentle with the airplane. What I see a lot is if I'll put the airplane in a significant bank, maybe a 50-degree bank, and say, okay, you have the airplane. They are way too aggressive in getting the airplane back to a wings level attitude. And, as I'll debrief them, I'll say, when you recover, you want to use standard rate and just be gentle when you get that airplane back to a desirable state.
Yeah, and obviously, if they do that well, maybe that will save their life one day.
Yeah,
and it's about being disoriented and then recovering from that disorientation. While that's maybe a simple scenario, I think it's one that we try to apply in every aspect of our training. It's so much different than saying, let's go to the practice area and let's do some stalls today.
Yeah.
And not really trying to establish a descent in a power off stall. I mean, that's when that's going to happen, right? And doing that at 3,000 feet, you still can establish a descent and put them in the scenario by which they're going to ultimately be in, if they ever have that happen close to the ground, right?
Yeah, and we do that with the airline. We call it upset training, and we will through the art of simulation, which we have very sophisticated flight simulators. We'll be upside down. We'll be 120 degrees over the top, and
Wow.
We have procedures for that, and that's a big deal. That's a big part of our training. I did some of it. Yes, I did stalls yesterday in a simulator, and we used the same recovery technique to recover from a stall as we would from we call it an undesirable aircraft state. Call it an unusual attitude. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. The airplane is not where you want it to be, and we need to get it back to it. So, the airlines spend a lot of time with that. It's just that the situations that we get put in, and these big jets are simulators. Obviously this isn't something you'd go out and do in a real airplane, but they're pretty, 60 degrees nose up, that kind of stuff. So it's pretty fun.
Yeah, that scares me in a Cessna. Never mind in a big jet like that. I would, obviously with no experience, I would be freaking out. But I'm glad you're trained, and I'll ride in the back when you're up front for that flight.
Yeah. I will say that when I was becoming a designated examiner, the FAA authorized me to go out and actually observe a check ride, and the first check ride I observed was a young man at actually your flight school. He did a really good job, and in fact, at the end of the check ride, when he was gone, the applicant was gone, I went up to the real GPE and I said, was he really, really good? And he goes, oh yeah, he was really good. And I said, okay, because I thought so, because this guy knew stuff that I was struggling to know. But when he gave him the unusual attitude, he put that airplane in a serious bank. I mean, it was. I'm not going to say any numbers on the air, but we were way over there, and the guy recovered really well. And I'm in the back of the airplane thinking, man, this is better than Six Flags back here. And I asked him, I said, so do you normally give him that an aggressive of an unusual attitude? And his comment was, yeah, I probably overdid it a little bit there. I said, okay, good, because that's what I was thinking. So. It was
I never liked those. I can remember my instructor telling me to let go because I would grab quickly. Like as soon as he started moving us around, I'd want to grab that yoke and recover because I didn't want to get. And you're probably normally 10, 20 degrees either way. It's not that big, but with your head down, your eyes closed, new to aviation, it seems like a lot of stuff's going on during those unusual attitudes.
Yeah.
So when we had Paul Craig on the first time, Paul talked a lot about what he did with NASA and the FAA to create a lot of the scenario-based training, I guess, techniques, right? And I think it goes to kind of what you said. It's not just the book work or understanding the book components of each thing that we're doing in the aircraft. It's really understanding how we do it. And I could probably tell a million stories, but you think about crosswind corrections, you can read about that, taxiing with crosswind corrections or wind corrections on the ground. You can read about that all day, but until you feel a wing coming up on your left, you don't really understand the practicality of that, right? And so it's a very different thing to have a scenario where you actually are taxiing on a windy day and you understand those facets of taxiing with wind correction versus just reading a book about it.
Yeah, it's a light bulb moment. I mean, I think if you got out there and you actually felt the wind, a left quartering tailwind, and you realized, oh, geez, if I have the aileron up, that's going to lift that wing. That's not what I want. I want that aileron down. And again, it's a light bulb moment. You go, oh, yeah, now I get it.
Yeah, so what should CFIs do, Wally? I know you have some ideas, and what would be, if part of our plan is to do a little cross-country practice, how can I make that the best scenario-based cross-country training that I can do?
Well, I believe throwing a divert in there. I mean, okay, we're going to go from airport A to airport B, and sort of along the way is airport C. So on the way to airport B, how about give that applicant or that student a scenario, whether it be a systems scenario with the airplane isn't performing exactly the way you want it to. Is this something that we should consider going over to airport C for? Maybe the weather at airport B is below what we consider safe, or maybe there's a medical emergency, or heck, maybe you just got to go to the bathroom. But hey, we can divert. I mean, you're driving down the road, and the plan is to make this drive from your city over to San Antonio, and it's a 3-hour drive. You're planning to not stop, but an hour and a half into the trip, you've got to go to the restroom. So what did you do? You stop at Buc-ee's and you go to the restroom.
From those that aren't from Texas, you miss out on a great place called Buc-ee's, and look it up online. It's the largest convenience store in the world, and has the cleanest bathroom, so everybody stops there for sure. Well, and I think in that same scenario, if I'm going to do a 50 nautical mile cross-country trip, and I'm an instructor, and I want my students to be the best pilots they can possibly be, I definitely think introducing a systems conflict of some sort. Hey, let's pretend the vacuum system stopped. What are we going to see, or what are we going to experience, and how do we handle that? Because even in VFR conditions, that could be disorienting to a brand new pilot, and they've got to figure out what to do. And is that a reason to turn around and go back, or is it a reason to divert? We've used the example of an electrical system many times over, and that might be, if you don't practice it, you're not going to know what to do when the real thing comes. And I just listened to a recent audio book, and it was talking about two people taking on an adventure. I won't go into all the details, but the two professionals were going on the same adventure, and one prepared for every possible outcome, and the other didn't. Kind of stuck to minimums and took the right amount of food for a good no interruptions in this scenario. And one of them didn't do so well, actually died, and one of them was very successful. And I think it's the same thing for us in aviation. If we don't practice and prepare, we're going to be no better than our best practice when the real thing hits the fan, right? When we do lose an electrical system, we're only going to be as good as we've practiced over and over again. We're going to divert back to what we know, and if we've never practiced, the outcome's probably going to be really, really bad.
Yeah. I everybody who's ever listened to the show knows that talking about electrical system failures is near and dear to my heart. I was actually, it was about a week ago, I flew a friend and a mother and his mother up to Little Rock, Arkansas from the San Antonio area. And we were going into North Little Rock, Arkansas. And while talking to Little Rock Approach, I heard a 172 going into Pine Bluff, which is just south of Little Rock, Arkansas. And it was interesting because as I talk about electrical failure scenarios in the ground portion of a lot of my check rides, we talk about how you're going to handle it with air traffic control, what you're going to say to them. And this person that I heard on the radio, it was almost as if that person was my student, because he just told Approach, we have had an alternator failure. We do not have an electrical system failure, but our battery is not charging. We may lose our ability to communicate with you here shortly. And it was just clearly stated. Even if the controller didn't understand what an alternator did or what its purpose on the airplane was, the pilot clearly stated to him what was going on, and the outcome was very successful. And again, in a 172, an electrical system failure shouldn't be a big deal.
Agreed. And it's a scenario that if you fly for a dozen years, you're going to experience an alternator that stops charging a battery or something wrong with the electrical system that you're going to have to react to. And not every time is that an emergency. If you were in IMC at night, that's a completely different ballgame and probably is an emergency. So I guess as students, no matter what phase of your training you're in, understand that training today is a million times better than it used to be. I think one of the things that Wally and I both feel strongly about is that you don't need to do all the written work before you start flying a plane. Much like he's learning how to fly a new plane today, and he is in the cockpit of that aircraft doing scenario-based training within 3 hours of starting that training, you too should practice and learn those things in the cockpit, in the plane, and not just through book work. You'll be much better for it as well. And then keep practicing. Challenge your instructor to challenge you on scenarios. Hey, what could happen today? And let's put that into play on this cross-country trip that we're going on. This maneuver that you keep asking me to do, why am I doing it? What's the scenario by which it's going to make me a better pilot? And put that into your training, put that into your repertoire as you are working with your instructor to be a better pilot. It'll make you much, much better as well. And finally, prepare with the ACS, right? I think too often we talk about the ACS, and I still see new applicants that have listened to the show and claim they listen to the show and talk about how much they listen to the show, not know the ACS as well as we want them to know the ACS. But each of those things that you're going to have to be tested on should be taught with some scenarios to make you a better pilot as well.
Yeah. And the ACS is a reference document. A lot of times student pilots will say, well, I've read the ACS, and I want to say, well, come on. I don't think of the ACS as a document that you go and read. It's something that you refer to. In other words, a reference material. Okay, let's say I just went out and I did steep turns with my instructor today. Well, maybe tonight, hey, let me look up all the stuff about steep turns in the ACS. What are the standards? What are the different elements of an ACS of steep turn as per the ACS?
Yeah, and we should know those numbers before the check ride and be prepared for those maneuvers based on that ACS for sure. But there's other things too that more are book work, like weather and understanding weather and how that might impact. But all that can be incorporated in your training. And as Wally said, it's a reference book. It's a reference manual. The syllabus should guide the training, but you should also be incorporating and looking up those maneuvers and things in the ACS as you do your training as well. So when you trained 40 years ago, very different. As you train today, it's all about scenario-based training, getting in the cockpit, doing those things. I know next week we're going to talk about systems. We haven't done any systems in a while. We're going to talk about systems. And there's no reason why you don't also incorporate some scenarios around your systems training. And don't just look at it in a book. Don't just look at it in the POH. Go out there, find a mechanic, find an airplane with the cowling off of it, and learn about the systems in real time by touching and seeing things on the aircraft. We'll talk more about that next week as we dive into kind of all the systems on these four-cylinder engines and aircraft. That's next week. Until then, fly safe and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.